Good morning. How is everyone? So today we are going to do a kind of introduction to the Platonic dialogue. Now I'm doing this lecture for a few different courses here, and some of these things are going to be a little review, and some of the things will be a little tangential to the focus of depending on the course. But there's three things we want to do today. First, we want to answer this question of what is philosophy? What is philosophy? Platonic dialogue, in a nutshell, establishes what philosophy would become for the next roughly 2,500 years. Famous British philosopher from the early 20th century, Alfred Whitehead. He famously said that the history of philosophy is nothing but the footnotes to Plato. Basically, he had established all the major categories of thought, all the major issues, and that everyone was basically almost kind of filling in the details or filling in the minor points after that. What is philosophy? In fact, it's something very simple, and it's something that's entirely relevant to any human being's life. And what's so beautiful about the Platonic dialogue is the way in which, because it is a drama rather than what would be called a philosophic treatise, it animates philosophic questions through dramas, through plays, characters with certain dispositions and attitudes, different attitudes and therefore different opinions, people with personalities and points of view. Talking about things, this is important, talking about things that are concerns for every or any human being. So things that are relevant to us, things that are relevant to you. The next question deals with Socrates. He is the hero, the kind of philosophic hero of almost all the Platonic dialogues. Plato was, of course, the student, one of the premier students of Socrates, and in writing his philosophy or questions that pertain to philosophy, he makes Socrates the central protagonist. So we'll learn a little bit about his life and what makes him distinct and why maybe Plato chose him as a central figure. Then what we want to do, and this will be relevant to all the readings we're going to do from Plato, is to look very specifically at the Platonic dialogue as a literary form and what Plato does structurally in terms of the way he presents things that becomes relevant to understanding both who Socrates was and what philosophy is really all about, because it seems to be that what Plato does is gives us a depiction through Socrates of the life of philosophy. And Socrates, this is particularly true for those of you reading the Apology of Socrates. Socrates is more than just a man. We might say that he is philosophy itself personified. His life is exemplary of the life of philosophy. As this kind of personification of philosophy, one thing that's highlighted throughout all Plato's works is really the unusual aspect of Socrates. He's strange, and maybe he is a kind of Xenos. He is a kind of alien in his particular concerns, in his outlook, in his desires from the ordinary person. He stands out, and there is this combination of a fascination with this character and also something quite alien and odd that is disconcerting or unsettling, right? And that seems to have something to do with philosophy itself and what it's really all about. So let's take a look at the Platonic dialogue. So we've got three people who are central in our narrative. There is Socrates, who lived from 469 to 399 BC. The Apology, the trial and death of Socrates, then takes place in 399 BC. In particular, Socrates lived during the high classical period in ancient Greece and Athens. He was an Athenian, which is the great city-state of all the Greek city-states. So important little background here. The high classical period is the 5th century BC, and high classical Athens is understood as the kind of pinnacle of Greek civilization historically, and has been celebrated by world civilization ever since then. It is one of the main founts of Western civilization, and why it remains so relevant to today. Basically, this was a period of kind of civilizational excellence in many domains, starting in the arts like painting, sculpture, architecture, in poetry, and of course the great poetic works of ancient Athens included Greek tragedy and Greek comedy, right? Also, their politics. It is in Athens primarily in the 6th and then 5th century BC where you have the full development of the political form of democracy, right? The form of government that we all take today as being the most just and righteous form of government. Then, of course, there are great developments in history. Herodotus and Thucydides basically invent the entire discipline of history in the West as a kind of academic discipline. And then, of course, philosophy. And the Greeks, if there's one primary inheritance we get from the Greeks, it is philosophy. And Socrates does something very crucial and very, for lack of a better word, revolutionary when it comes to philosophy. Up to the time of the era of Socrates, most of philosophy consisted of what was called natural philosophy, right? And natural philosophy is what we would today call natural science, right? Investigating the natural world, the universe, the cosmos, and everything in it, from the stars to all types of natural phenomena, to try to come up with scientific explanations of causes, why things are the way they are and why things happen the way they are. And perhaps one of the most important, I have read, I can't totally confirm, that the Greeks invent the concept of nature. And when we think of the Greek word is physis, where we get our word physics. What is physics? It's the study of nature, right? When we typically think of nature, we think of sticks and stones and rivers and sunsets and so on and so forth. And of course, that is derivative of the original meaning of the word. But strictly speaking, for the Greeks, nature just meant, among other things, primarily the source of causes in the world, and that phenomena that was observed in the world was caused by immanent forces that could be observed with our senses and understood by our minds, observed with our senses and understood by human reason. Therefore, the causes of things for philosophers were not the gods. The gods were not the cause of things in the world, but natural forces, which is to say immanent, what we would call physical forces in the world, right? So once you have the concept of nature, that causes occur in this bodily realm, this realm of the empirical senses, then you have a source of being, of reality, that then can be understood by human reason, right? What the first principle of God is that God is a supersensible being, or a God is a supersensible being that is not fully intelligible by the human mind. So therefore, the philosophers understood the world as capable of being grasped by human reason alone. Number one, it was intelligible, and if it was intelligible, human beings could understand it, and what was unknown could then become known, and philosophy stood for that investigation of the world to know things. And we'll say more about that in a moment. Socrates would turn the sights of philosophy away from the natural world, away from the investigation of natural phenomena toward the investigation of things that matter to us, human phenomena, the world of human life, the world of questions about human happiness, morality, virtue, how a human being should live, these types of questions. So if you look above here, we have this great painting by Michelangelo called The School of Athens, right? The School of Athens. And it has a whole variety of historical figures, actual historical figures. And they're all figures related to philosophy from the ancient Greek world. And at the center, under the arch, you have on one hand Plato on the left side, and on the right side you have Aristotle, right? And he's presenting them as kind of making up the totality of the central thinkers on philosophy. So Socrates, who lived during this 5th century BC, was the teacher of Plato and Plato, the student of Socrates. Plato lives from 421 to 347 BC. And then Aristotle is the student of Plato, the kind of star student of Plato, who lives from 384 to 322 BC. And there is this connected lineage starting from Socrates and descending down to Aristotle. And while Plato and Aristotle have many superficial differences, really it seems like what they do is derive their initial, you might even say, inspiration from Socrates, and they draw on this kind of well, and in many ways they are addressing the same kind of things from Socrates' point of view, and are a kind of explication of his life in many ways. Socrates, first and foremost, let's put it this way, he was a guy, he was a dude, and in many ways he's eminently relatable and also eminently distant from us. What did Socrates do? He was born, he philosophized, he wrote nothing, and he died. Today, when we think of philosophy, we think of people writing abstruse books with bizarre technical language in a kind of perverse way that doesn't make anybody a buck or deal with any kind of practical causes. Socrates, for all his interest in the basic questions of life, was a kind of eminently practical person, and he was deeply connected. He was not a person who lived in an ivory tower. In fact, quite the contrary. He lived the life of a full citizen at Athens. Of course, it was a democracy, and in ancient Athens, to be a citizen is to be politically involved, because that's what citizens do, to be an active participant in the political life of the city and politics. In Book 3 of Aristotle's Politics, he says that citizens are ones who deliberate. Citizens are ones who deliberate. And what did he mean by that? He said citizens are the ones who deliberate about the basic and big questions of how they want to live their lives as a collective, and make decisions with one another through speaking and thinking together in public, deliberating, right? How should we live? Question mark. Of course, we all have different opinions, so we're going to be forced to deliberate. We're to talk and think together in order to arrive at answers of those challenging questions. As a citizen, he was a soldier. He fought, ironically, this pinnacle of achievement of the 5th century BC turned out to be also one of great catastrophe. There's this Peloponnesian War between Athens and her allies and Sparta and her allies, and Athens actually was defeated, and its high watermark of civilization was basically brought to an end by this war. And Socrates' life really, this was a very long and drawn out war. His life really started prior to the war, and his mature life, basically, he lived it through this ongoing war. And this forms much of the context of the Platonic dialogues. He was a soldier during this war. He fought nobly in battles in a variety of different ways. He was a public figure. When Plato put pen to parchment, people in Athens knew who Socrates was. He was a very well-known figure, if not firsthand, at least by hearsay. And that becomes important in some of the dialogues, that everybody knows Socrates. He spent a lot of time, not in the ivory tower, but in the agora. And if you've ever heard that expression, the agora is actually the Athenian marketplace. It's where people came together to kvetch, but primarily it was a marketplace where merchants were selling things, and people got together to ply their wares, and that involves conversation. And of course, as any marketplace is, it brings all types of disparate people from different walks of life together, because everybody's got to do business. Everybody's got to engage in economic exchange. Athens was a kind of intellectual and cultural capital of ancient Greece, and it was a very open society, something we as New Yorkers can strongly identify with. And it really brought people from all around the Greek world and beyond. And when it brought those people, it also brought their ideas. So you see Socrates as a person who's intrinsically interested in absorbing ideas from other points of view. And this raises one of the big themes of the Platonic dialogues, that we are all born in a native land that has a certain set of fixed opinions about what is right and what is good and what is beautiful. The Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident. These are the kind of founding opinions of American society. And if you question them, if you don't believe them publicly, that's quite a provocation. And to be a philosopher or to engage in a philosophic life is intrinsically to question what you call received opinion, the opinions, the traditional opinions that you're raised with. So the Agora was this place of exchange and conversation, and not just economic. He wrote nothing, and this life that he led ties into the fact that he wrote nothing. Today, people want to write books and make a name for themselves, and it's part of their professional career. Socrates, there was no profession of Socrates of philosophy, such as it were. If you were a philosopher, you somehow managed to get by on whatever resources you had, and there was no place for it within the social division of labor and economic division of labor. And Socrates is, by the average Athenian citizen, seen as a very strange person, because number one, he's not doing the typical things you see ordinary people do, which is, I got to go to work 9 to 5 and make a living for my family. He had a family, he had a wife and 2 sons, but he did not provide terribly well for them. It wasn't exactly a model homemaker, because of how he's spending his time, the fact that he's not making any money doing it. So not only does he not have a typical profession, but he's talking about things that for many people are going to seem very strange, right? He's raising questions that ironically everybody knows the answers to. And if everybody has answers to, why are you raising these as questions to begin with? And the fact that he wrote nothing just illustrates not only that there was no, as one professor joked, there was no tenure for Socrates, that what he was doing was out of a kind of fundamental life impulse, is part of his being, rather than just a kind of going through the motions of a professional existence. converse with his fellow citizens and foreigners about things that matter most for human beings, and seeking the knowledge that would bring happiness to human beings. So he turns the attention of philosophy away from talking about the natural world and to talking about human nature and what matters for human beings, the relationships, virtue, happiness, these fundamental questions that every human being has to solve for themselves. Plato was Socrates' student. Plato went on to establish what's called the academia, this location where he ran a school. And of course, that's where we get our word academy, meaning, school or university. And it was Plato, in fact, who starts to formalize philosophy as a kind of institutional structure that would be passed on in a formal way through an educational institution. Unlike Socrates, who wrote nothing, Plato wrote dialogues to capture and reflect philosophic education, which comes in the form of conversation. Plato seems to, and Socrates seem to conceive of philosophy simply as speaking and thinking together about these core questions of human life. So when we think of philosophy, we think of discerning the true facts of things, right? Facts. We live in a culture that is obsessed with facts. And what I'd like to do is make a distinction between the actual meaning of philosophy, which is actually love of, it literally means love of wisdom, which is interesting because it's not love of knowledge or love of facts, it's love of wisdom. That is not to say knowledge isn't crucially important. So for a moment, I actually want to make a distinction between knowledge, true knowledge, versus awareness of facts. The sole object of knowledge for Socrates and the Greeks was nature, whether it was the nature of the natural world or the human nature. And here we're using the word nature not just to describe an imminent cause in the world that can be explained, but that nature is, in addition, it's something permanent. It's something that always is. And therefore, you can only have knowledge for the Greeks, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. You have knowledge or true knowledge of things that are always and ever the same, right? So knowledge is about nature. That is the object of knowledge. Whereas facts, by definition, are things that change. And if you think of and this will be really important, if you think of our society, we are constantly inundated with facts. They constantly change. And the facts that you learned yesterday become completely meaningless as you have to download all the new facts and regurgitate them on command. Knowledge is not something that changes, and knowledge is an achievement or a kind of permanent possession of the human mind. One more point here. One of the important distinctions introduced by Socrates and Plato in our thinking about the world, because if you really think about what philosophy is it's a kind of pursuit of understanding, a pursuit of the truth, and one of the main things that it helps to fashion in human history are critical thinking skills, ways of understanding and looking at and grappling with logically the world around us in order to better understand them. And one of the most fundamental distinctions that Socrates and Plato make is the distinction between appearance and reality. Appearance and reality, right? We live in a world of appearances that are changing and shifting, and those appearances are what we would call facts, right? What you read in the paper every day. Appearances. The question is, what is the truth? And the truth is the reality the unchanging reality that exists beyond the facts or behind the facts. And facts, how do we gain knowledge about the facts or awareness of the facts? Through our senses, right? Our five senses. And one of the basic motifs of Platonic philosophy is that the superficial appearances of the world are gleaned through our senses, but our knowledge of the true reality behind the facts or behind the appearances is gleaned through our mind's eye, through our kind of making inferences based on the facts, right? So we see the facts of the world with our eyes, but we see the truth beyond the facts with our mind's eye. And the underlying premise of this whole way of thinking of philosophy was the fundamentally deceptive or illusory nature of the appearances of the world. And the appearances could come in many forms. They could come in like a visual distortion of something you see far off. Or more likely, the appearance could come in the form of someone presenting a certain conduct or way of speaking to you, and you discerning that what they're presenting you is not really the whole truth. And that what philosophy really seems to be intent on discerning are the kind of immaterial patterns of truth that exist behind the kind of fluctuating appearances. Love of wisdom, right? Notice it's not knowledge. Wisdom is a kind of prudence. It's a kind of good judgment based on experience. You could say applying one's reason to an expanded amount of experience. And it has to do with a kind of good judgment in the matters of life, right? Particularly where the rules of life, which are general, don't seem to have a clear applicability in a certain circumstance, which happens all the time. We can't rely on rules to get by in our life. We have to make judgments because they're either the rules are too general in a certain circumstance, or you've never heard of a rule for how to deal with the circumstance you're encountering. So philosophy seeks to articulate a rational account or understanding of the central questions of human life. What have we talked? What is that called? It's a logos. A logos. A logos is a rational account of the world, in which it is a non-fiction account, non-narrative, based on evidence and the application of logic to evidence. And that's important because that's something that everybody can engage in, right? We can all see the evidence because it's based on something empirically available to everyone. And then, of course, logic is universal, right? In the sense that 2 + 2 always equals 4 because it's built into the logic of it. Logic is universal and necessary. So philosophy becomes a fundamental way of communicating and searching for the truth in a collective way, right? We notice that all these dialogues involve multiple characters reasoning and thinking together. So philosophy is the examined life. This is really crucial. In the Apology of Socrates, he says the unexamined life is not worth living. The unexamined life is not worth living. Well, philosophy turns out to be the examined life, the life of investigating the key and fundamental concerns of our existence that matter ultimately to our own happiness. And this raises the question that apparently these things are not self-evident to begin with. Apparently what we know when we're born and raised and the opinions we're given are not necessarily salutary toward achieving or efficacious toward achieving our own happiness. And that there's a problem between the opinions we've received from our society and the truth, and that the opinions of our society may not be identical to the truth. And here you see a basic premise that for the human being to be happy, there must be a certain type of conformity with the truth. One lives in the light of the truth, right? When we look, one class will be looking at 1984. This will be a society. One of the interesting, fascinating elements about 1984 is one of the fundamental elements of it as a totalitarian, dictatorial type of society, is that it has, because of the nature of the society, because of the type of control and the complete unfreedom of the citizens, it has to operate by presenting fundamental deceptions about every essential fact in the society, right? And of course, it culminates in the whole society being profoundly unhappy as a result. And of course, this does raise questions. Is ignorance bliss? Are there things we'd rather not know about as human beings? Would we prefer to be in the dark and live only a partially examined life? This also raises other questions about how we spend our time as human beings. We'll look in the symposium, for example, the opening dialogue between Apollodorus and his friend. We see that one of them spends his time making money, and the other spends his time hanging around Socrates and wanting to know everything he says and does every single day. And you ask yourself, well, who the hell has time for that? I got to work 9 to 5 and pay the bills and raise my children, right? And it turns out that friend in the introductory dialogue to the symposium is very much like us, because he has to deal with the practical needs of life like everybody else. And philosophy seems to raise questions, however important truth may be, it may be a need that is higher on the rung and slightly further away than our more basic needs, and we're spending most of our time satisfying our basic needs. So there's another conflict. The examined life exists in conflict with the opinions of society, and those opinions hold the society together in a fabric, in a community. A community is a group of people bound by some intense principle in common. It's their way of life and their understandings of right and wrong and what justice is, or the gods that you pray to. And philosophy is raising unsettling questions about those opinions that people have been raised with. And of course, if you want to get by in society, one has to accept opinions and conform with them, even if one deep down doesn't agree with them very often, because our first priority is to get by. And then the second thing is simply we don't have time in our lives to raise these questions. Okay, so the object of philosophy or philosophic knowledge is nature. We've talked about this. Philosophic questions imply that there is a distinction between what is true by nature and what people believe as a result of the conventions of their society and its habituation and socialization. So this is really crucial in the two works for the literature class, The Apology of Socrates and Book 7 of the Republic, in which questions about convention versus nature, which is to say, what do people believe based on opinion, and what happens to actually be true. And we get to Book 7 of the Republic, in the allegory of the cave, convention implies man-made. And when those prisoners are looking at the shadows on the wall, they're actually looking at man-made things. But here's the interesting thing. They're not aware that the shadows that are projected on the wall are being projected by man-made artifacts. They think they're naturally occurring and therefore give them a status that's higher than what they actually would had they realized that they were just inventions of other human beings. Really, those objects, those idols, those statues that they're showing are synonymous with the opinions of certain people, the dominant opinions that are then projected on all the other citizens. And we're raised to believe that these aren't just opinions. We're raised to believe, in the language of the Declaration of Independence, these are self-evident truths, self-evident truths. And of course, when Socrates goes in to the courtroom in Athens on trial for the various charges that he's been accused of, he tries to rebut those charges to the extent that he does by simply talking about his life. And what does he spend his life doing? Going around and talking to people about fundamental things and discovering that they don't know anything, their opinions are wrong, and that these people have established great renown and reputation precisely because of those false opinions. Right? So it turns out that his questioning, his seeking of nature, or his seeking of the truth of things, socially immediately comes into conflict with people who have, you could say, made a living by propagating opinions which turn out not to be true. Why philosophy? Who gives a shit, right? I mean, I think there's always students, they span the gamut in how they respond to something like philosophy as to something totally abstruse and mind-numbing versus something that's utterly fascinating and piques their curiosity. Aristotle had has a very basic answer, and for our one class that looked at the ethics, this answer will not be surprising. The meaning of philosophy, according to Aristotle, the student of Plato, human beings have a natural desire and capacity to know and to understand the truth, to pursue moral excellence, and to manifest their knowledge in the world through action. So the priority here, he says, human beings have a natural desire and capacity to know. Aristotle understood the human being fundamentally as the rational animal. It's our reason that fundamentally distinguishes us. We have in our souls, with all the classes who talked about the distinction between reason and passion in the souls, and that reason, in a sense, is actually a type of a passion in that it has a desire as an object of desire, and that's knowledge, understanding, wisdom. Our rational impulse is what makes us curious. You ask yourself, why does Eve pick that fruit in the Genesis story? Why does she pick the fruit? Well, obviously the fruit is not a fruit. It's symbolic. It's symbolic of knowledge, right? And if the fruit is appealing because of its physical features, it looks good to the eye, it smells good to the sense of smell, and it potentially tastes good, right? Then all those kind of attributes can be transferred as a metaphor onto the appeal of that fruit to the mind, right? The mind desires food called knowledge, in the same way the stomach desires food because it tastes good. And Aristotle, of course, his whole conception of happiness is that the highest form of happiness is the highest use of our reason through things like intellectual curiosity. We all desire to know. We're all curious. Because we have reason, because we can think about the world, we naturally use that faculty, that power, because it's simply pleasurable to exercise the powers we have at our disposal. This passage here, from the textbook here, is from Aristotle's Metaphysics. And this is the first thing he says in the Metaphysics. He says, all human beings desire to know. An indication of this is our likeness for the perceptual capacities or faculties. For even apart from the utility, they are liked because of themselves, and most of all, the one because of the eyes. For it is not only in order to do an action, but even when we are not going to do anything whatsoever, that we choose sight over all the others. The cause of this is that of the perceptual capacities. It enables us to know most fully and make clear many differences. So let's tease this out. We desire to know. And after he says we desire to know, excuse me, he speaks about our perceptual capacities, our five senses. What do our five senses allow us to do? Take in information from the world, right? And allow us to know about the world. And he clearly begins to establish analogy between the eyes and our desire to, and the pleasure of looking, versus the mind's eye and its capacity to know things that are invisible about the world. The appearances are visible, and the true knowledge is something invisible just beyond it. Well, what's the function of taking in the information? He actually gives us two answers. He says it's useful, right? We need to know about the world in order to get by. But he says, even when to perform actions, he says, but even when we're not concerned with doing something useful or for the sake of utility or practicality, he says that we simply enjoy looking at things and perceiving them. And that becomes a parallel to what the mind's eye does with the nature of things, right? That not only do we need knowledge for practical reality, for our practical needs, but that we desire to know simply for the pleasure of understanding, right? And I don't think anyone can really fully appreciate philosophy unless you have an impulse toward understanding for its own sake, knowledge for its own sake, the pleasure of understanding how the world fits together, and to see it in a different way because of that. So Platonic dialogue is a drama. It's a drama. Plato is a poet and a philosopher at the same time. He deals with questions of philosophy, through applying reason, but he presents it in a poetic form, right? A Platonic dialogue is a dramatic dialogue, a drama, a play, a story, a narrative, involving the discussion of a central moral or political question that relates to human existence and human nature. It raises fundamental, big, essential moral and political questions, particularly in the most broad sense. How to live? What is the good life? How should a human being live? And more specifically, the question is this: given what I am, as a certain type of being in the cosmic order of things, how should I live? Right? I'm a human being. I have reason, and it allows two fundamental things. Reason allows me to choose between options, because reason and speech, logos, allows me to be aware that there are options to be had, right? And then it allows me to reflect. Yes, I can do this, but what should I do? It allows me to conceive of my life not only with choices, but with choices that are better and worse, right? And that the only way a human being can live is precisely by reflecting on those choices and determining what the right thing is to do. We say we want to be happy, we say we want a good life, but you can't possibly know what to do, you can't possibly act until you've reflected on what is the target of your actions, what is the correct target of your actions. So there's some very interesting features of the Platonic dialogue, a philosophic drama. It's a hybrid of diegesis and mimesis, which is to say narration and imitated dialogue. It is a hybrid of mythos and logos. Mythos meaning a narrative account, which involves characters and is essentially a fiction, but notice an account trying to explain something. And a logos being a rational account, an account that's brought before the tribunal of reason, and it has to be based on evidence and logic, accessible to other people. Therefore, the Platonic dialogue is a poetic logos, or poetic philosophy. And then the question becomes, why would a philosopher write in this manner or form? And one of the classic motifs coming out of ancient Greece that is still true as a kind of stereotype up to this day is that philosophy seeks the truth and appeals to the head, appeals to reason, and poetry appeals to our aesthetic sense of beauty, and it appeals to our emotions, our passions, and appeals to our heart. So poetry appeals to the head, and philosophy appeals to the heart. So there's a synthesis, or kind of hybrid, between those two things. And I think the first answer is How can you inspire and show interest in philosophy except by showing its impact on actual people, right? And their emotional response to it, right? Different characters responding differently to different types of questions. And obviously, the passions are never completely removed. Also, the poetic aspect, a narrative aspect, has an engagement. I mean, narrative is the kind of most fundamentally engaging way. You have conflict, you have characters who act in interesting and unusual ways, and you seek to see how the conflict plays out and how it's going to be resolved. Another reason was a kind of competition that Plato seemed to have had with Homer and the other Greek poets himself. There was what was called the ancient quarrel between poetry and philosophy. Poetry being myth, narrative account, and philosophy being a rational account. What is this quarrel really about? Why would there be a quarrel? It seems kind of unintelligible. Well, if you look at it today, there's still that same divide between a kind of more sentimental or an emotional understanding, an intuitive understanding of the world versus a kind of rational and scientific understanding of the world. The quarrel had to do with who should rule over the people and the city, which is to say, who should educate the young. Now, my literature classes address this question. We've addressed this. But Homer wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey, and the poets were the people who talked about the gods, and religion was the fabric of ancient Greek society, right? And Homer was understood as the educator of Hellas. His books, the Iliad and the Odyssey, were a kind of template and model depicting what Greek civilization was like. It was the Bible for the Greeks. It depicted what it meant to be Greek and how one acts. And Plato seems to be in a kind of competition to displace the poets with a more rational, you might call it a rationalized or a more scientific poetry, but still in the form of poetry. Why? Because Plato's not foolish enough to understand that what people want and thrive, they still have, what is a human being? They are body and soul. They are reason and passions. And if you want to speak to a human being, you need to speak, if you want to speak convincingly, I should say, you have to speak to all parts of them. You have to speak to all parts of them. And what is philosophy? It's understanding of the whole, kind of comprehensive understanding of the totality of things. So in speaking to the human being, you speak to the totality. This synthesis or hybrid of poetry and philosophy is going to raise also the tension, particularly in the symposium, between beauty and truth. Beauty and truth. The poetry is the domain of beauty, philosophy the domain of truth. There's some funny things. What are the most beautiful words? Lies, things that turn out not to be true. There are things that turn out to be too good to be true. Flattery, right? So lies are beautiful, right? And the truth is ugly, right? Because the truth is not interested in conforming with your opinion, right? The truth is the truth is the truth, and it has no regard for your feelings or your point of view or your background or anything about you. It's utterly and crudely indifferent. So there's something, the truth can be ugly, right? And what's fascinating about Socrates, and this becomes a key element in some of these dialogues, Socrates is particularly ugly, right? And as a personification of philosophy, it seems rather appropriate because people are able to confront this ugly man, and yet they're fascinated by him, despite what would otherwise be a kind of natural aversion. So here we've got beauty and truth, we've got the poetic and the rational, and then the question becomes, in what way specifically is the Platonic dialogue a mythos? In what way specifically is it a logos? How does it embody these kind of species of literature? Platonic dialogue is a narrative account because these questions basic questions of philosophy are presented in the context of a drama, with a setting, with characters with a specific psychology. If you think about the essence of a lot of philosophy, it speaks in generalities, right? Because it asks those universal questions. So what has Plato done? He's cloaked the generalities in the specificity of concrete beings. He's a novelist. And why is that important? Because it allows us to relate to what's being discussed. And particularly, we're going to relate to Socrates as a character in a kind of profound way. We're going to find him, just like the other characters find him, incredibly fascinating and intriguing, but there's also something alien and kind of off-putting about him. The dialogues are generally based in historical fact, and they're based on actual historical figures, but we're not dealing here with a literal transcription of history. These works are not history, even though they have historical facts built into them. Nor are the conversations transcripts of what people literally actually said. They're logos or rational account because the explanations are based on logic and evidence, and they're open to public scrutiny, which is to say, the scrutiny of the reader. So, in what way are the Platonic dialogues nonfiction? Well, first, this is interesting. All the Platonic dialogues are based on actual historical figures, or actual dramatic figures from Greek poetry and myth. So very often invoked are characters from Homer and other poets. But these are, of course, if you read Homer or Hesiod, you would find all these characters described. So everyone mentioned in a Platonic dialogue is an actual historical figure in one way or the other. Next, Plato very self-consciously places clues and references in each dialogue that point to specific dramatic dates, which means the time and place that the dialogue is taking place in the 5th century BC, which provide historical context, and he provides a key amount of actual facts of Greek history during this high classical period, right? And it seems the basic premise of philosophy that human nature is universal, human history is not just the history of discrete empirical facts, but that those facts can reveal general truths about the human condition or general truths about human nature. And therefore, the specificity actually contributes to the universality in a strange way. In addition, many of the general events described, most people believe, actually happened. And even if, for example, they didn't speak in exactly these ways, Socrates likely talked about issues in this way generally. In particular, the Apology and the Symposium, for example, are generally considered actual historical events that happened, particularly the Apology, which is the death of Socrates at the hands of the Athenian jury. That is historical fact. So we've mentioned this a little bit here. The fictive aspect of the Platonic dialogue is that the conversations are not literal portrayals of exactly what people said. They're not transcripts. They are literary contrivances and constructed and crafted and edited artistically by Plato. That's really important because this establishes an important distinction between how we speak extemporaneously in conversations with our friends and our peers versus what a writer can do when they sit down and edit and contrive and perfect and polish the structure of a work. The structure of these works is immaculate, and they go well beyond anything that could be found in ordinary speech because it's spontaneous, because it goes in different directions. So, for example, in a Platonic dialogue, when someone appears to go on a tangent, in reality, that tangent fits into the overall logical edifice of the dialogue in a very specific and very strategic way, and the goal for the reader is to figure out, well, how does that that fit in. Particularly we'll notice in the symposium, the way in which all 6 speeches build on one another. And the irony is, if this event happened spontaneously, where a bunch of guys just got together to give speeches on love, there is no way that they could contrive the commonalities and the kind of riffing off of the previous speech. And you see as the speeches go along, they actually start to synthesize the previous speeches in the way that would be almost impossible. You'd have to have the kind of photographic memory to do something like that. So you know you're dealing with a literary artifact, something that's been contrived and polished and constructed. And then the last evidence of all this is, everything's fiction. The characters are just characters, right? On a page. And we know the person who's really speaking behind all this fiction, all this myth, and it's Plato, right? Plato is really the one in control, but here's the funny thing, you never see his voice. There is not one Platonic dialogue in which Plato speaks in his own voice. And he's always, almost in every dialogue, he's using Socrates as a mask to conceal himself and a mouthpiece to speak through that mask. But of course, like any dramatic poet, you do not associate the lead character's speech with the true thoughts, of the writer. And this is perhaps the most intriguing thing. When Whitehead said that the history of philosophy was the footnotes to Plato, one way that could be understood is, well, what the heck did Plato really say? Because he never said anything in his own name. And in the academic, business of interpreting Plato, that is rather an elusive thing, because he sits behind all his characters the way a playwright conceals themselves behind. Question, what does Plato want to say? Does he have something to say? If you think of any modern philosopher, they write in their own name and they tell you exactly what they want to say. And in fact, if they haven't been clear about what they're trying to say in today's discipline of philosophy, they failed. And of course, for Plato, this is exactly what he wants, a kind of strategic concealment or dissimulation. So all this history becomes really important in how it's used, because it's not really history, because it's a play, because it doesn't claim to be empirical historical fact. And to understand what Plato is doing here in terms of the overall significance and meaning, it's really summed up by this passage. The author says this: history is the story of things that only happen once, right? A single, concrete, particular empirical event in the past, right? It says great literature. What is literature? That's poetry. That's myth, right? That's fiction. Great literature tells us the story of things that happen all the time, forming part of the human condition and revealing, to add, you could say, human nature, right? History is what actually happened. Literature is the kind of thing that happens, that's depicted, to illustrate something about the kind of thing that happens universally in our existence, right? So think about it. When we read history, we read what happened in 1492. I need to know exactly happened. When you read literature, it's obviously based on history in the sense that we all have experiences. That's another name for history, experience. And then literature, a novelist writes their own experiences in one way, shape, or form. But history are things that happened once, and literature depicts the kind of thing that happens universally in our lives and explicates these kind of fundamental realities. Last couple thoughts here with the literary form of the Platonic dialogue. Almost every dialogue is initiated by a what is question, right? And these what is questions, you can see that's the essence of philosophy. First, to ask the question, to acknowledge that you might be ignorant about what the answer is. Now, what's the catch here? We've been raised in society with opinions. We all know what the answer is. Our society has given us the traditional beliefs about what the answers are of a given topic. There's nothing problematic. There's no reason to raise the question. So simply the fact that you're raising the question is an acknowledgement that you're dealing with a philosophic mindset that's fundamentally skeptical of opinion, that wants to examine it, interrogate it, and determine what is true based on reason and evidence. And that, of course, is unique, because the average person doesn't say what is. They just say, I already know. So raising the question, what is already acknowledging your own ignorance, because you're seeking a higher standard of understanding that's not based on holding a belief, but finding the truth. These what is questions have everything to do with how we should live as a human being, moral and political questions about our way of life. And of course, we all want to be happy, but since we're human beings and our lives are variable and we have reason and we're ignorant, we don't actually know how to live. And the only way we find out is by asking the question. And by accepting the opinions of our society is actually probably a guarantee of our unhappiness, because, of course, we need to understand what human nature is and even our own nature. So questions like, what is justice? What is virtue? What is courage? What is piety? The symposium almost asks something like, what is eros? Okay, so some ironies in what classes are going to be reading. In the symposium, there is no what is question. There is no what is question. Rather, they say they're going to praise eros, right? And that implies they already know what eros is, but it turns out they end up effectively asking this what is question. But they say we're going to speak in praise of eros, a very different orientation in terms of the form of speech between asking a question and about eros and praising it. In the apology, again, there is no what is question. And it's a very unusual dialogue, because instead of having a lot of dialogue, it's a long speech or a long series of speeches by Socrates. Dialogue implies a kind of back and forth between at least two or more characters. And of course, in Book 7 of the Republic, we're already well into the Republic, and the what is question in the Republic is asked in Book 1, and that question becomes, what is justice? What is justice? Of course, these questions illustrate our natural desire to know and our curiosity to seek knowledge and understanding, because we're the rational animal. That's Aristotle's reason as to why. And then the other thing is, these questions are relevant to our own happiness, and we're ignorant about them, so therefore we're compelled to ask them. Intriguingly, once these questions are asked, the answers to them unfold in a very specific form that is distinct, apparently, to Socrates' own way of life, his own way of carrying on conversations, and also to the Platonic form. The conversation or the dialogue that they have in response to these questions is called dialectic. Dialectic. And in one sense, dialectic is just a fancy word for dialogue. Dialogue between a conversation. Actually, dialogue, dialogos, this literally means speech between two people. Di meaning two, right? So dialectic is really just a fancy word for dialogue. But in Platonic philosophy, it means, in the Platonic form, means something more specific. It is a dialogue that proceeds through an ongoing process of question and answer. And actually, it's not just question and answer. It's question, answer, and then question that answer, and then an ongoing process that's initiated from the what is question. And the goal of this process is to move from opinion or belief to truth or knowledge. And the idea is, when you first ask this question, the first answer you get is an unexamined opinion. It's what you believe, right? And what you believe has not been rationally scrutinized. So there is a response to that answer in the form of a question, and then the person is forced to revise their question in an ongoing way. And we see a varying amount of this in the dialogues we're looking at here. In the symposium, actually, this is the natural way for Socrates to speak, this question and answer. He's a gadfly. And you see this emerge at various moments in Socrates' own speech, where he questions Diotima or he questions Agathon. You see this back and forth. Whereas most of the symposium consists of long speeches. In the courtroom drama, you see it in him actually, in the Apology, you see him interrogating Meletus in particular in a question and answer process. And then it gets very funny toward the end of the Apology, where Socrates speaks and would like to have a dialogue with the entire jury. There's about 500 people there. And what he does, because he can't actually have a conversation with 500 people simultaneously, is he says something from his point of view, and then he says, well, if the Athenian people were to say of me, and he creates a question that they ask him, and then he answers the question that is a kind of hypothetical or imaginative question that he is seeing as coming from them. So he thrives on this format, and it's almost like when he's not engaged in this back and forth repartee, he's kind of like a fish out of water. But the idea is that this is the process of reasoning together by which people get to the truth. And it's called the Socratic method. It's the kind of basic classroom method that we're really all familiar with. You raise a question. Notice, the teacher doesn't give, does Socrates know anything? When he asks a question, does he already have an answer for it? In many cases, he's thought about it a lot. He does have a lot of answers. But instead of telling his truth to other people, he leads the horse to water, and he asks the question, and then he never gives them the answer. He keeps trying to tease it out of them, and he has a direction he wants them to go. Right? And this is just a form of critical thinking. It's one of the most fundamental forms of critical thinking. We should also say, if you're familiar with, research science today, people set up experiments and they have scientific method that holds them to certain criteria and standards of reasoning if we're going to call something true or correct. And what do? They publish an article, and it's not just, that article is not just published as the truth. It then receives a tremendous amount of peer review in which a whole group of other scientists dealing with related problems scrutinize the findings of and the method of the original scientist to try to find any weaknesses and interrogate it for any potential problems. Not because they want to be cruel, but because the best way to get to the truth is to reason together in a kind of collective way, because each person has their own strengths, and each person in the process has their own kind of natural vulnerabilities of personality and emotion. And this issue of starting with opinions is vital, because in moral questions you must start with opinions, because the opinions are the facts. If we're talking about natural science, you go out and observe the natural world, right? But if we're trying to, what is justice? What is the right thing to do? How should we live? These questions of how we ought to be rather than how we actually are. The only place we can find evidence for those things initially is actually to ask other people their opinion of them. So, dialectic, a special type of conversation that moves from opinion to truth through this very specific process of question and answer, question, answer, and ongoing chain until the dialogue is over. Let's raise the question. What is opinion and what is truth? How do we know what's one and what's the other? Of course, part of the problem for philosophy is that the dividing line between opinion and truth is really ambiguous, especially for moral questions. How do you prove, let's say you make this thesis. in light of human nature, it is clear that human nature has in it that all human beings are equal, right? Because of their nature. Right? How would you go about proving that? That would be quite a challenge for all kinds of reasons. It would be a very different question from, the leaf on the tree is green, and this is why. I can give physical answers to that, right? Whereas the moral question, I need moral facts, which are much more elusive. An opinion for Socrates is an appearance. An opinion is the result of the way the world appears to me. And the Greek word is doxa, and it's literally the word doxa, which is opinion, one's own opinion, has to do with the way things appear. So therefore, an opinion is the way things appear to me as the result of my own individual nature and nurture, the habits that I've grown up with, the indoctrination, the education I've received, the conventions that have been trained into me by society, right? And here's the important thing. An opinion is a belief, right? Opinions can be true and opinions can be false. The problem is you do not really know whether the opinion you hold is true or false because you hold it as a belief. And to hold something, a point of view as a belief, is to hold it as an article of faith, which is to say, I believe it's true because I say to myself it's true. I have not, the very definition of an opinion is a statement, a proposition that I have never sought sufficient evidence to determine whether it's truly true or false. Why? Because it's unexamined. So it's an unexamined proposition. What's the goal of philosophy? To interrogate, to examine that opinion. So it is the realm, opinions is the realm of appearances, and Socrates, as we'll see, particularly in the cave, but also in the Apology of Socrates, opinions are the they are the fluid or the air of society. They are the air we breathe cognitively and intellectually. Society is a realm of opinions, and the problem is opinions are held by people, and we care more about people and their influence over us than we care about the truth. The truth or knowledge is the reality behind the appearance, and it's gleaned with the mind's eye, so we can only get to the truth by taking those opinions and interrogating them and seeing beyond them to the reality of things. And obviously the big part of opinions for the Apology or for Book 7 of the Republic is that they're the result of the traditions and conventions of society. What's tradition? Literally the handing down of a way of life from one generation to the next. And we do it that way, not because it's rational or not because it's true, but because that's the way our father, our grandfather, and our ancestors did it. And ultimately they got it from the gods themselves, right? So opinions are based, have misty origins, and also connected with our own emotions, our passions. And of course the truth is something based on our rational analysis of things. Okay. So this is particularly pertinent, and we'll conclude with this. It's particularly pertinent with the Apology of Socrates and the Republic. The relationship between truth or philosophy and the city. Philosophy is the thing that seeks the truth, seeks wisdom, knowledge, understanding. And the city. What is the city? It's a group of people carrying on a collective way of life that are bound together, a community. People hold something in common. What do they hold in common? A way of life. Based on what? Core beliefs about what is right and wrong, just and unjust, good and evil, good and bad, useful and not useful, beneficial and harmful. They are unexamined opinions, right? The fuel, the air of society is opinions. That's why in Book 7 of the Republic, the city is presented as a cave with shadows being cast on the wall. And we are prisoners, not of the physical kind in physical shackles, but we are intellectual prisoners to the opinions that are indoctrinated into us from our youth. And when you get kids early, they'll believe whatever you tell them until they get old enough to discriminate for themselves, if they discriminate. And of course, to discern that there's something wrong with opinion, one would have to believe that it isn't telling the truth about what it claims to tell the truth about. So, the city is a group of people sharing a way of life based on opinions. The city is made up of people and their opinions, their feelings, and their reputations based on them. So think about, someone on the news, a pundit. They have opinions, right? And they get a reputation for those opinions. They write books, they write articles, and people go, oh, wow, that's a brilliant idea. So if you come on the show and attack their opinion, in effect you're attacking them and their livelihood, because their opinion is not only an expression of them in their point of view and their nature and the way they're raised, but their opinion is the thing that has given them reputation in society, if it in fact has done that. So you see the problem, for example, in the apology of Socrates questioning the opinions of the elite members of his society. It's not, to him, it's just an intellectual exercise in the desire for knowledge for the sake of happiness, the desire of knowledge for its own sake, but for them it is a threat to their standing in society. So he has to be shut up, he has to be censored, right? It sounds like YouTube and Twitter and Google these days. That's a topic we'll get to. The opinions of people come from their nature and their circumstances, nature and nurture, right? Therefore, the opinions of a person are really an extension of who they are. So you question their opinions and they're questioning who they are. Let's take the obvious example. The atheist comes up to the theist, the believer, and the believer says, I believe in God. And then the atheist gives a scientific analysis of why God doesn't exist. That's not just an attempted proof of the non-existence of God, but it's going to be potentially a personal threat to the believer, and vice versa. The problem is, the truth doesn't care about your feelings or your opinions. It doesn't care whether you're a prince or a pauper. And therefore, since the city runs on the atmosphere of opinion and belief, unexamined opinion, the city is a cave with shadows on the wall, and the shadows represent the myths, the man-made. Remember, the artifacts in the cave being cast on the wall are man-made objects, and of course we don't know that they're man-made. As we grow into society, we assume they're naturally occurring, and therefore give them a higher dignity than simply man-made things. The shadows are the myths, the lies, the half-truths, the opinions, the self-evident beliefs of society on which they run. So this is fascinating. What you see here, and this is one of the central themes of Plato, and it comes out in the Apology in Book 7 of the Republic very strongly, because they're two dialogues that have very central political themes, that the truth and the city, or philosophy and the city, do not naturally coexist with one another. Now, this was really pronounced in the ancient world, because every ancient city, regardless of where you were in the world just about, was some form of a theocracy in which the political structure and the political principles were married to the religious structure and the religious principles. They were one and the same. Your laws come from the gods, right? Therefore, to question the gods is to question your city, is to put you fundamentally, not just religiously, but legally in conflict with your city. Why? Because the social order, the political order, the justice of the city rests on those underlying beliefs, right? To call into question the gods is to call into question the law that was founded by the gods, right? In our society, it seems like this problem wouldn't exist, right? We live in the post-Enlightenment world. The Enlightenment was a moment in Western society, Western civilization, that sought to make society over based on reason, right? Very much in what Socrates and Plato, in fact, had in mind. They did it in a slightly different way, but the general notion was that society should be rational, people should believe the truth, and if we applied the light, the sunlight of reason to religious belief, to moral beliefs, to social orders, to opinions about the social order, and how people should live, that we're going to live in an enlightened society in harmony with the truth apprehended by reason. That happened in the 18th century throughout Europe and also America. America's founding documents, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and the Federalist Papers that explain the Constitution and what it means and how it works and why it is the way it is. These are all central documents in the American component of the Enlightenment. And we would think that this tension, therefore, between reason and truth and the life of the city or the life of our political communities is resolved. But I think if we look around today, there are numerous, and because what rules in our cities today, it's not, or our societies, it's not religion. Religion is made a private matter, right? This is a radical innovation in modern politics to make religion essentially a private matter. And religious belief is not obligatory in society. It's not even potentially necessary. And what happens is science becomes our authoritative source of understanding of the world, right? If we're going to look to truth, we're going to look to some scientific endeavor. And yet we live in a world that I would say is still no less mired in this conflict between the truth and the opinions of the city, right? We see it in the forms of today of various types of censorship and some things we'll get into next time. Okay. So this lecture has been really designed to kind of sum up kind of fundamental context of these dialogues that you're going to read. And in the next lecture, we'll get into the meat and potatoes of the specifics of each of these dialogues. Thank you.